We have breaking co-defendant news tonight. Donald Trump's criminal co-defendant in Georgia, Jeffrey Clark, is under a bond order not to communicate with any of his co-defendants in the case like Donald Trump. And so Jeffrey Clark, lonely Jeffrey Clark, has chosen today to communicate with me. And he chose to do that today on a day when he was exposed as thinking out loud that he might not be worthy to become the next Attorney General of the United States, which he was secretly plotting to become with Donald Trump so that Jeffrey Clark could try to use the power and influence of the Justice Department to criminally overturn the results of the presidential election. A text exchange made public in court today reveals, according to the Washington Post reporting, that on December 30th, 2020, Jeffrey Clark, who was an obscure assistant attorney general overseeing some civil cases, discussed the plot for Jeffrey Clark to take over the Justice Department. The Washington Post reports the text saying, "I'm praying," the Justice Department official told Congressman Scott Perry, who less than 2 weeks earlier had arranged for Clark to meet the president, "and wonder if I'm worthy or ready." "You are the man. I have confirmed it," Perry replied. "God does what he does for a reason. If God chose lawyers, God would never choose Jeffrey Clark, the indicted lawyer." There is ample proof of that in the details of how Jeffrey Clark became an indicted co-defendant of Donald Trump's in Georgia. Jeffrey Clark was correct to, quote, "wonder if I'm worthy or ready." He wasn't. Jeffrey Clark wasn't worthy and was never going to be ready to become acting attorney general or to advise a president of the United States about anything involving the law at any time. Living under the lonely court order banning him from communicating with his criminal co-defendants, Jeffrey Clark decided today was a good day to communicate with me, because he took issue with my discussion on this program last night about Donald Trump's campaign announcement yesterday that he wants to use the government to close down MSNBC. I pointed out that Donald Trump is so stupid he actually thinks that the government controls MSNBC's access to, quote, free government-approved airwaves. Donald Trump doesn't seem to know that cable television actually passes through a cable, not over the airwaves, thereby completely avoiding the jurisdiction of the FCC, which has never had 1 minute of control over cable television or cable news. I pointed out last night that the FCC does have control over NBC, CBS, and ABC, which were founded as over-the-air broadcast networks. Jeffrey Clark mounted a lawyerly attack in his way against me on Twitter, beginning with, "Lawrence, it's not enough that you're not very bright. It's your phony sanctimony that forces me to point this out." I don't know about you, but I have a feeling he would have attacked me even if for once I had managed to leave out the phony sanctimony. Indicted lawyer Jeffrey Clark then wrote a long tweet trying to insist that Donald Trump was right to say that cable television uses free airwaves. It was the most idiotic composition on that point that a lawyer or non-lawyer could have possibly come up with. When Jeffrey Clark's plot to take over the Justice Department became public, every lawyer in America who was not also later indicted with Donald Trump wondered how Jeffrey Clark could be so stupid. Today, Jeffrey Clark, in his Twitter communication with me, convinced me beyond a reasonable doubt that he is even stupider than I thought. Today, Donald Trump got gagged once again, this time by an appeals court in the state of New York. After 15 days of considering Donald Trump's appeal of gag orders against him and his lawyers in the civil fraud trial in New York, the appeals court ruled against Donald Trump and reinstated both gag orders in full, which another New York judge had temporarily blocked while the gag orders were being appealed. And to my great personal relief, the appeals court in New York did it the old-fashioned way, without one word of explanation. In the 21st century, judges' written word count has skyrocketed to the point where we have become used to them issuing long written opinions on every judgment and ruling they reach in pretrial proceedings and certainly in appeals court opinions. It was not always this way. In fact, The 4 judges who considered the appeal did not write a word about it. Their finding was issued in writing today by the clerk of the appeals court, who simply said, now, upon reading and filing the papers with respect to the motion, meaning Trump's appeal, and due deliberation having been had thereon, it is ordered that the motion is denied. The interim relief granted by order of a justice of this court, meaning the temporary block of the gag order, is hereby vacated. Signed, Susana Molina Rojas, clerk of the court. That's it. After all that expensive appeals lawyering by Donald Trump's lawyers, written briefs by both sides, evidence presented by the court security officer about how many hundreds of threats and are phoned in every single day to the judge in the case and the judge's clerk who is working on the case. After all of that, Donald Trump's lawyers got one sentence, a one-sentence order written by the clerk of the appeals court. Immediately after the appeals court upheld his gag orders, Judge Arthur Engoron said in court, so I intend to enforce the gag orders rigorously and vigorously, and I want to make sure that counsel informs their clients of the fact that the stay was vacated. Shortly after that, Donald Trump, who was not in court today, attacked the judge's wife once again in a lying social media post about her. The gag order prevents Donald Trump from attacking his favorite woman to attack before the gag order, who is the judge's law clerk. Now that that woman is protected by the gag order, Donald Trump has turned his threatening public harassment on another woman, the judge's wife. And this is where, once again, Donald Trump is getting extraordinarily special treatment. No judge in American history has ever allowed any other defendant to publicly attack a member of that judge's family. We are awaiting a decision by the federal appeals court in Washington, D.C. that is considering a similar gag order on Donald Trump that Donald Trump's lawyers have appealed. The gag order was ordered by federal judge Tanya Chutkan. In the oral arguments to the appeals court, it certainly sounded like each judge on the appeals court would support some version of that gag order in that case.